Good evening, and thank you for being part of Lex Aquatica, Mr. Affendi. I am Pravena, and I'm very happy to be moderating this session today on marine biodiversity. So please share some important details about yourself and before we move on to our session today.
Thank you, Ms. Pravena, and for having me here to talk about marine biodiversity. My background is basically I'm a coral reef ecologist. I started studying ecology in the Faculty of Science in UM, and I did my postgraduate degree in UM as well. But I have experience doing work in Australia, Indonesia, and Japan on coral reef ecology. And at the moment, I'm a research officer in the Institute of Ocean and Earth Sciences in University Malaya. We are high COE in UM, one of the few high COEs in UM. Yes.
That's amazing. That's a list of achievements, Mr. Affendi. I think it's very interesting, especially as a law student. You know, you don't know all the nuances in marine science and so on and so forth. That's absolutely incredible. So perhaps now we can move on to our session today, and maybe you can share with us your slides on marine biodiversity and the threats and key issues pertaining to this issue.
Yes. The first slide just shows, I just wanted to show again that Malaysia is actually a maritime nation. It's surrounded by a lot of the Straits of Malacca, the South China Sea, and Sundu Sulawesi Sea on the right. Next slide, please. And we are blessed with having rich marine resources, because from this map, you can see the global distribution of corals, mangroves, and seagrasses. These three ecosystems are the three main marine ecosystems of the world. And the first figure that you see on the top is just to show you the coral distribution of the world. You can see the darker reds are high diversity of corals. So we are actually at the center for the coral diversity of the world, and it's called the Coral Triangle. Not only for coral reefs, we are also the center for mangroves. As you can see, the darker brown in the map, Malaysia is part of that. Plus also for seagrass. You can see that Malaysia is part of the main diversity globally. So we are sitting at, because of these three main ecosystems that we have, and we have the highest, Malaysia is very, very special. And we are the hotspots of marine diversity of the world as well. Next slide, please. However, there are threats. And since I'm a coral reef ecologist, I'm just going to show you about threats to coral reefs. And but these threats also relate to the two other marine ecosystems of mangroves and seagrasses. The first main overall arching threat is overfishing. As you can see from the top, from the left-hand side, some fishing activities are on nurseries themselves, because coral reefs, seagrass, mangroves are nurseries for fish. But we are fishing, some of us are fishing in the nurseries and catching young fish, which is quite bad, because actually they are not matured enough to breed, and we're catching them already. The next one is marine debris. There's a lot of marine debris in the seas right now, such as ghost traps, lost nets, and whatnot. And I'll tell you more about ghost traps after this. Also, there's indiscriminate fishing using non-selective gears, nets, and traps. And also, indiscriminate fishing also includes destructive fishing, which happens a lot in Sabah and Sarawak, where people are fish bombing to get the fish, and it destroys the ecosystem as well. Also, fishing, we shouldn't be fishing at spawning aggregations. There are places where fish congregate to spawn, and we shouldn't be fishing there. Some people do, and this is very detrimental to our fishing industry, to the fish. Also, we should not be taking too many big fish, even though so basically don't take the two small ones and don't take the two big ones, because the big ones are actually producing a lot of the younger ones. So overfishing, that's one of the threats to coral reefs, and also to the diversity, especially to the diversity of fish in coral reefs. Next slide, please. The other threat that is detrimental to coral reefs and also mangroves and seagrasses are the land-based source pollution. I'll go from the left first. So the first one is about septic systems. If you don't treat your sewage, there'll be a lot of nutrients and pathogens going into the water. This is very, very detrimental, especially on our islands. Second, chemicals, some sunscreens. Now we know that actually some sunscreens are bad and it could affect the flora and fauna. Next one is coastal development and surfaces. This basically brings sedimentations and toxicants. Stormwater runoff, sedimentation again, because it smothers the coral, smothers the seagrasses, and it could die. Deforestation, again, sedimentation. So you can see that actually pollution, land-based pollution, is mostly about sedimentation. The other one is oil and chemical spills. Any spills that you do, even in rivers or even in towns, even in cities, it will go into the river systems and it will be brought into the ocean. Construction, road construction, any construction also brings sedimentation. And the other one, the last one, is agriculture, which is basically if you're using a lot of budger, all the things that you give to the plants, and also chemicals to protect it against insects. So then you'll have nutrients coming in and also toxicants coming in. So all this will go in and into the water system, the rivers first, and then goes into the sea. So it causes disease, disrupts ecological functions, changes dynamics, and prevents coral growth and also seagrass and mangrove growth. Next slide, please. The last one, last but not least, is climate change. So climate change for reefs, there's a whole slew of threats, because coral reefs are actually what we call as the canaries in the coal mine of the sea. Anything that is bad that happens to the oceans, the first ecosystem that will be affected are coral reefs. So climate change, what happens is that basically it's about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The sea, the oceans actually are very, very good in absorbing CO2. So actually the oceans are saving us. We're producing so much CO2, but actually the oceans are the best in absorbing CO2 and also absorbing heat. If there were no oceans, the climate change, the air temperature would be unbearable by this time. The oceans are actually absorbing CO2 and heat. So what happens is that starting from the left, there'll be problems of warming oceans, there'll be problems of sea level rise, changes in storm patterns, stronger and more frequent storms. There'll be a lot more rain. So that means there'll be more runoffs. And previously, about sedimentations on the land, it will come in more into the sea. There'll be altered ocean currents. So this will be a problem in connectivity and also where the fish will travel. And lastly, ocean acidification. With more CO2, the pH will go down and we'll have more acidification. Next slide, please. So climate change impacts. The worry now is that first, temperature, there'll be more mass coral bleaching. Basically, the corals will turn white and die, high mortality. There'll be higher CO2 in the atmosphere. Therefore, there'll be lower pH, like I said before. So coral, seagrass growth, especially corals, will be affected. And in the end, questions of the corals will be dissolving or not. So that's another question. Third is more intense storms, more corals breaking. But as you can see from the graph on the right, it's taken from the International Panel of Climate Change report, the recent one. On the y-axis, the straight one that's going up, is the global surface warming. And on the x-axis, which is the horizontal axis, is the year. So the black line is actually what we have seen already. And anything above 2000, the year 2000, are all the models that have been calculated by scientists all around the world. You have the red line, which is basically the A2 line, increasing population, the human population, but slower development. And you have the green, blue, and orange. So the orange is basically what we see if everything, we change our lives. We stop producing so much CO2 and whatnot. But the red line is the one that we are on at the moment. So for coral ecologists or coral scientists, corals, we see that if there is a rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius, what we'll see is that, so that if you follow the y-axis and you hit the 1.5 degree, and then you go to your right, so that's the 90%, there'll be a 90% coral loss. So then you can see actually by 2050, or even earlier, if we proceed at what we are doing now, if there's no change in our marine policies, our laws, how we manage, there'll be a 90% coral reef loss around the world by 2050 or earlier. So that's our main worry, and that's the main message that I want to leave with you. And we go into the question section.
Thank you, Mr. Affendi. That was really an insightful presentation, and I think it just opens our eyes to how impending the climate crisis is and how urgent it is that we should attend it as soon as possible. I have a couple of questions for you pertaining to marine biodiversity. So firstly, in your opinion, what is the biggest obstacle that is faced in the enforcement of law pertaining to marine biodiversity?
Wow, that's a good question. Well, in my opinion, the main obstacle at the moment for the enforcement of law is actually, we have the Environmental Quality Act of 1974, right? It mostly operates at the federal level, this EQA, but the enforcement of land or marine issues are usually is operating at the state level. So basically, you'll have the federal guys saying this is the law, but then at the state level, it's a totally different story. And basically, what needs to be done is that the federal and state laws, it needs to be merged and harmonized to have an efficient enforcement system to be able to better protect our marine diversity and our marine ecosystems. So that's the main obstacle. But a close second to me, because that one is law. Luckily, I remembered my law, legal terms before this I learned in first year. So the near second, actually, in the biological terms, right, for Malaysia is actually we need to map our three main marine ecosystems so that we can prioritize which area that we want to enforce these laws on. Because actually, only mangroves are mapped properly in Malaysia. We know how much mangroves we have and where they are, because it's easier to use our remote sensing technology nowadays to detect the mangroves. For coral reefs, because it's underwater, remote sensing using satellite, we can't see anything below the 10 meters. So basically, we had to go out. So I spent about 25 years doing coral reef ecology at the moment now. So we've helped to map some of the systems. So at the moment, I see that we actually only have mapped 70% of our coral reefs, which is about now, basically is about 1,600 square kilometers. That's coral reefs. It's even worse for our seagrass, actually. Seagrass, only about 10% is already mapped, which is, we've only mapped 50 square kilometers of seagrasses. So if we don't have a map of where our marine ecosystems are and how much we have, how then can we actually, okay, if people come in, they're doing damage to them. If you don't know where they are, how do we know that it's damaged? So that's my near second biggest obstacle.
Yeah, I think those are will be very helpful to our fellow participants of the Marine Public Policy and Law Review competition, because it gives us insight as to the issues kind of affecting the threats towards our marine biodiversity. So leaping off that tangent, you mentioned earlier that Malaysia is part of the Coral Triangle, so we're actually very lucky in that sense. However, I wanted to ask you a bit pertaining to the pandemic. So clearly tourism has its effects on marine biodiversity, especially if we're talking about coral reefs and so on and so forth. Can there be any legislation or policies to be enforced when it pertains to tourism and its adverse impact on coral reefs and marine biodiversity?
Yes, they should have. We should have some kind of very strong laws when regulating tourists, because basically tourism, wherever we go, especially for coral reefs it relates to the carrying capacity of islands, because the reefs are around our islands. So if there's a lot more tourism coming in, tourists coming in, there'll be effects, right? So we need laws to govern that. Not just the tourists themselves, actually. Before tourists come in, even before they go, actually, there are issues. So basically, before tourists arrive, we have to develop the coastline. So unsustainable development, such as unnecessary airports, marinas, jetties, hotels, and whatnot, especially in marine parks, there'll be a problem. So we need very strong EIAs under the Department of Environment to manage this kind of development for tourism. Because not just before, after also there'll be a problem, because if there's a lot of people going to the islands, they will produce sewage waste and silage waste. Oil pollution, light pollution, turtles will get problems going to shore, and even noise pollution, because then some animals are afraid of noise, they will go away. And also, when there's a lot of tourists, some of them break the corals, because when they snorkel or dive. So there should be enough law to fine people that if they do anything like this. Yeah.
Yes, I think it's very important to actually talk about what our contributions are to marine ecosystems, because when we talk about policy and law pertaining to the preservation of marine ecosystems, it feels so distant from the normal people. And actually, when you examine it further, you can see how involved we are in threatening these ecosystems. Yeah. So moving on from that, talking about law and regulations, I read that in Palau, there was a fishing moratorium that was implemented to prohibit fishing during spawning seasons. It was something that you covered earlier. So in your learned opinion, do you think that such a measure would be effective in Malaysia?
Oh, definitely, please. We really need a fishing moratorium, because with that, it actually protects the aggregation, not just the spawning seasons. We need to know the spawning season, but also the sites, the actual location, because fish also they have a place to eat, they have a place to rest, they have a place to meet their mates. Yeah. So there are areas, but actually in Malaysia, we have very minimal knowledge of when and where the spawning aggregations are. So at the moment, a lot of my fish ecologist friends are trying to learn where they are, where these areas are. The Department of Fisheries are also doing that as much as possible. but we need more support, not just from the government, but actually from the private sectors to help us to map these areas. It's very, very important, because if we don't protect it during their time of spawning and at their place of spawning, we cannot manage our fisheries well. So our food security will go down. So yes, a fishing moratorium is sorely needed for us to manage our fisheries much, much better, so that we can get more fish to eat, because I love fish. I love my asam fish, asam pedas fish, and I would miss it if our fisheries are not managed well anymore.
Understood. And I think I can say the same for myself. I think from what I've gathered, Mr. Affendi, a lot of our key issues seem to be pertaining around the issue of a lack of research or knowledge about key areas pertaining to our marine ecosystems. Is that correct?
Yes, we have a lot more to do, because we previously, we always look on land, the terrestrial biodiversity, and we're quite really good at it after so many years. But for our marine section, our marine sector, which is now with UNCLOS and everything under the exclusive economic zones, is 200 kilometers out, and we actually have more ocean area than land area, and we really need to fund and support more research in for our ocean area, so that we understand it and we can manage it better, so that it's not just for food security, it's for our economy, and also for the, for the oceans to be, our oceans to be very well managed.
Thank you, Mr. Affendi. I think that was very well said. So if I may wrap up, the key takeaway, if I could say that, from our session today is that knowledge and research about key areas in our marine ecosystems play a very large role in ensuring the conservation of our marine biodiversity. And I think this will be extremely helpful for all our participants to learn about. It's more of like the tip of the iceberg sort of situation, because from what you have mentioned earlier, it has been extremely, it's an in-depth thing, so it's definitely something that I'm very happy to learn about. So thank you, Mr. Affendi. I'm sure we have all learned a lot today, and we are so appreciative to have you here.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.